Mike, thank you very much for leading off and so candidly addressing some of the hot button issues. Let me throw you a hard one to start off. You mentioned the...
I'm playing basketball again out in Moscow, just so you know.
Good for you.
I've already had 3 injuries in 8 weeks. So.
You're going to the boards too hard. You mentioned the statement put out today by Nemtsov, et cetera, calling for abolition of Jackson-Vanik and making the point that the failure to do so plays into the hands of those who are anti-American, and they specifically made reference to President Putin. The hard one is as follows. The closest analog I'm aware of is back when the U.S. had the famous Helms-Burton legislation. Helms-Burton then against Cuba. It's kind of like Jackson-Vanik against Russia. And the Congress sent a study team to Havana to assess the impact on U.S. interests of the Helms-Burton legislation, which of course tried to tighten the embargo and limit the economic exchanges with Cuba. The congressional delegation came back and said, we came to one main conclusion. The Cubans that are on our side, the U.S. side, want to get rid of Castro, want to democratize Cuba, et cetera, tell us that that legislation in Cuba is widely called the Helms-Burton-Castro legislation because it strengthens the hands of Castro enormously. They said even Castro's opponents have to oppose Helms-Burton, and so it actually rallies more support to Castro, hurts our interests, should be abolished. Do you find that same kind of phenomenon in Russia, that the continuation of Jackson-Vanik actually hurts U.S. interests in the country?
Without question. I mean, yes. And let me talk more about what the Russians say. I mean, the statement today was an important one because they're saying it now as opposed to intermediaries like me saying it. But here's how it plays internally, right? Remember what Jackson-Vanik was for in the first place. It linked higher levels of Jewish immigration to most favored nation status. By the way, you know, I wrote about it at the time. Tremendously successful piece of legislation. I think it was very important legislation at the time. But the problem of Jewish immigration since 1994, every year, you know, there's a process that we go through to authorize that, is not a real problem. So what happens to the debate inside of Russia, this becomes, you know, these Americans so hate Russia that, you know, this issue that went away 20 years ago is still there because, you know, they're out to get us, they're out to destroy us. So it's a burden on the human rights activists. It's a burden on the Jewish community, by the way. I see Mark Levin's here. I went around to talk to many leaders of the Jewish community before this trip, knowing we'd be here. Not a single person supports Jackson-Vanik being on the book. It's a burden on them. It's not a useful argument for them. And so they would just assume to get rid of it and have a more interesting, modern, you know, contemporary conversation about the real issues that are facing those people, as opposed to having, you know, their opponents just roll out this, well, these Americans are so irrational that they're still, you know, withholding this for something that is no longer the problem. Let me also remind everybody that it used to be a different debate. I think this is a very important point. Before Russia had agreed to join the WTO, and now the Duma is going to ratify that sometime in May or June, that's going to happen. Before that happened, there was an argument that we disagreed with, the Obama administration, but at least it made, you could defend the rationality of it, which is let's hold Jackson-Vanik as a way to put pressure on us to get the right deal for WTO, to put pressure on, and that Russia did care about WTO. At least some people in Russia did. It's a hotly debated issue, as Anders knows better than I. But the pro-market, open folks, they supported it, and so they wanted it. That did create leverage on us. It worked, by the way. We heard those arguments, and we, you know, on poultry and pork are the ones I remember in particular. And we went back and we argued, and we think we got the right kind of deal. So there was a logic back then. But with Russia joining the WTO, that has no leverage on us. We're done. That train has left the station. So it's really hard to understand in whose interests holding this on does serve.
Okay, so if it's clear what you just said, holding on to Jackson-Vanik makes no sense. And if you're right before, certainly our study, which incidentally is out for you to pick up on the way out, I encourage you to do so. It's on the table. It's by Anders and Gary Huffbauer. Makes the case, as Mike said. But if you're right that that's a no-brainer in economic terms, which we certainly think you're correct, so then it comes down to linkage. And people want to link the abolition of Jackson-Vanik with something else. Magnitsky Bill or something else. You're obviously close to what's going on in the Hill. What's your prediction, and what's the likely strategy for trying to avoid linkage of that type? It's clear you want to avoid it. Do you think you can succeed, and what's the strategy?
Well, I like to say I used to teach courses on democratization and revolution at Stanford. That is true. And one thing I've learned from that literature is never try to predict the future about democratization or revolution. But I would say predicting what the U.S. Congress does is even more a scarier proposition. And I'm not qualified to do that because I'm not an expert on the U.S. Congress. So I don't know how to predict that. All I would say is it is the highest priority for the Obama administration. It's our top trade issue for this year. The president, just last week, meeting with the Business Roundtable, made that crystal clear. I encourage you to go read what he said if you haven't seen it. We have a very active engagement strategy with both sides of the House because it has to go through both, right? We're delighted to host Senator Baucus out in Moscow, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction on the Senate side. I think he had a very successful trip. You should ask him, but and in particular, we had him meet with people on the political side. We had him meet with human rights activists and people working to fight corruption, so that he could hear the argument directly from them, as opposed to a cable from me. And they're way more persuasive, frankly, than we can be. So we're doing that, and we. In terms of timetable, of course, we would like to get this done before Russia joins the WTO, because we don't want our companies to be adversely affected. And I want to say one other thing about that. It's not just a one-time thing. I hear some people say, busy year, election year, maybe we'll get to this next year. Well, that may be fine, in the abstract. But if you lose that market, if you lose, especially for our exporters, that have tough competitors, you lose it 1 year, you're fighting for the next 10 to get back to where you were the year you lost it. And so it is a tremendous blow on very specific companies if we don't get this done in a timely way.
Anders?
Yeah, Mike, let me draw you out a bit more on this Senator Baucus trip to Moscow now. It seems to me that
Montana Mafia. I'm from Montana, he's from Montana.
Yeah. And in particular, it seems to me that the U.S. Senator has hardly ever got such a red carpet treatment in Moscow on his own. So many top-level ministerial meetings. And at the same time, we are seeing in the media a massive anti-American campaign, which, for example, engages Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin. How do you make sense of these two totally contradictory signals? You pointed it out before yourself.
Well, I would say you are right about Senator Baucus's visit. I mean, he met with the president of Russia. That doesn't happen very often for a CODEL. I'm learning the language as a State Department official, and across the board, other very very productive meetings. By the way, it wasn't just the fact of the meetings; they were serious meetings. I guess I would put it this way: the anti-Americanism, which of course has included me from time to time personally, was something that we did not expect. It was somewhat shocking to us, frankly, especially because of the kind of relationship that we think we've been developing with the Russian government over the last 3 years. What I was told many times at the highest levels of the Russian government was they seek continuity in U.S.-Russia relations. And privately, that was the message from every single person I met with. And by the way, there's been a lot of reporting about, I met with the opposition the first day I was there. Actually, the first day I was there, I met with about a dozen Russian government officials, again, at the highest levels, and everybody said the same thing. And that's been a message that they've communicated to us. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have differences, and Syria is an excellent case where that's not a trend thing. That's we have some principles that are clashing there, and therefore, in the context of wanting that continuity, they treated Senator Baucus the way they did. We attribute the spike in anti-Americanism to the presidential campaign. Pretty obvious that somebody decided that there are votes to be had by increasing this stuff. As a social scientist, by the way, who used to do survey work in Russia, I'm not so sure. I want to see the data. We're going to try to collect some data on that. So we should have a discussion about that. I think, but that somebody had that hypothesis. The election's over, and so we'll now see if that was the true explanation or whether there's something more fundamental.
Okay, the floor is open for questions. Please identify yourself. Either go to the standing mic in the back or the traveling mic coming around and fire away. We've only got about 20 minutes. Mike's time is tight, so be succinct. Andy, right here in the front row.
Thanks, Mike. Great to see you here again in Washington. We had
identify for the group.
Andy Cutchin's Center for Strategic International Studies. We had another one of our meetings with executive branch and congressional staffers last week, such as that you participated back in May, and two things emerged out of that I would note. One, that the efforts to educate the Hill, they need to be ramped up very, very, very significantly and very, very quickly. That was kind of across the board from the Hill staffers. A lot more has to
on PNTR.
Yes, on PNTR. A lot more has to be done by the administration there. A lot more. One point in support of PNTR was kind of applied to the broader U.S.-Russian relationship, that if the United States cannot do something that is so obviously in U.S. national interests, then how can Mr. Putin and company actually trust us to do things on much more complicated issues where we significantly disagree on? So there could be a linkage in that other direction that could be unpleasant for the relationship. My question has to do with the larger U.S.-Russia relationship. I've been a huge fan of the reset. You guys have accomplished a tremendous amount. The problem now, it seems to be, though, as you look out on the headline issues, they principally seem to be ones that we have fundamental disagreements on. You mentioned Syria, you mentioned missile defense, Iran, I would add to that perhaps, the political system. You didn't mention Iran. Could you talk about what you would expect to get from the Russians vis-a-vis Iran?
Sure. Well, first on your comment, I take the point, and we have an interagency team that engages with the Hill on a pretty rapid pace. We've been doing that for over a year. I know others in the business community have been doing the same. I guess I would just plead to those that need to be educated. Go to the USTR website. It's all there. They also represent the American people, Andy. It's not just, there's jobs that are going to be lost. There are farmers that are not going to be able to sell their stuff. And particularly on the agriculture, if I could just take a little time on that, these are small. This is not just big businesses. There's a lot of different companies involved here who's literally, they're going to lose a big market. I take the point, but I also want to be clear that all the argumentation is out there, and we've been engaged in what I think is a pretty proactive. I see my colleagues in the back; they can jump in because I've left town now. I'm in a different set of negotiations with the Russians, not the Congress. But I take the point. We got to do more. I'm glad that your report is out, and I encourage anybody that thinks about this and has views on it to also take the time to educate the debate. With respect to Iran, I didn't mention it because I don't see it yet as a fundamental issue of disagreement. I see our cooperation on Iran has been one of the successes, both in that first period when we were seeking a diplomatic solution. And again, I think a rather creative idea that we worked with the Russians. Then, in terms of the sanctions, We were with Russia, and that was asymmetric, by the way. Let's remember, Russia had real economic interests that were lost because of 1929, and politically, the damage to their bilateral relationship, of course, was much greater than the damage that we faced, right? And that was a big, important achievement that we did. We drifted a bit, of course, over the last several months because of our unilateral sanctions. That's what the Russians would call them, and by the new sanctions that the U.S. Congress have put in place, particularly with the National Defense Authorization Act, the amendment there, that has created some tension, and we're working that. I just was last week dealing with those set of issues. But I'm more impressed by the unity of P5+1 than the disunity right now, so that's why I didn't deliberately mention it. Missile defense, yeah, we've had some disagreements, but I got to tell you, I'm an optimist on missile defense. For a couple of reasons. Yes, we do not have missile defense cooperation with Russia in the year 2012. But we've only been trying to do that for, just several months. I mean, let's remember, this was an issue of confrontation, fierce confrontation, for 3 decades. So why should anybody be surprised that we haven't been able to get this done in a cooperative way in a year? Yes, we have the public statements about this, that, and the other, but when you talk about the facts and when you talk about physics as opposed to politics, I think this is actually a place where, with time and with effort, we're going to be able to cooperate with Russia. I'm an optimist on that. Syria, more difficult, but even today, there were some signs that there are some things that we can now agree upon. I encourage you to see what Secretary Clinton said about it. We're still in the middle of that negotiation, but, incremental progress. And the final thing I would say is, yeah, it's hard. Welcome to the real world. People say, oh, you went there at such a hard time to be ambassador. Yeah, I'm interested in the hard jobs. What should anybody have expected otherwise? And we're partially a victim of our successes, too, right? I read your report about what the administration should do in the transition, and probably half a dozen others here. And go back and read what you said we were supposed to do. We checked off a lot of those boxes. And as a result of that, what's left on the table are the harder issues, by definition. And our attitude towards that is we're going to continue to work them along the principles that I outlined, right? Without accepting linkage, without throwing our values at the door as we go in, and without accepting trade-offs between our relationship with Russia and our relationship with other countries that we have vital interests with.
Okay, question in the back.
Thank you very much. I'll just speak loudly. Josh Rogan, Foreign Policy Magazine.
Hey.
Welcome back. I'd like to ask you, since you left, a lot of us here in Washington have been watching what seems to be an increasing trend of civil unrest inside Russia. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that and tell us, do you see that movement as growing and continuing? Were the presidential elections of last week free and fair? And how would you grade the overall trend of democratization in human rights in Russia? And how does Russia's continued arming of the Syrian regime speak to that? And what do you make of the coordinated campaign against Secretary Clinton and yourself personally, including statements by President-elect Putin claiming that you are undermining the Russian government by supporting the opposition and the protest movement? Thank you.
So you know better, but everybody else doesn't know. Sign up for @McFaul on Twitter, and you'll see every single one of those questions have been answered on my Twitter handle. I want to get back to that, by the way, because it affects foreign policy as well. A really interesting thing that's been new for me. So remind me. Now I've forgotten all the questions. Civil unrest. Let's start with that one. First of all, I wouldn't call it civil unrest. I would call it civil society renewal. And there's a difference. There's a big difference. This is not a movement that is seeking the violent overthrow of the current regime. And people need to be very clear about that. They are very clear about that. They seek to engage through peaceful actions to reform the existing system. And that's different than other places around the world, right? And they want you to understand that they are different, and that's what they're trying to do. What I would say, I just said, I used to teach courses on these topics, and what I've learned is predicting where these things go, we're really bad at. Because I'm not a structuralist, by the way, in terms of the academic debates. I think contingency and agency matter. So predicting contingencies and agencies, by definition, is hard to do. But what I would just say in broad strokes is that there's real politics in Russia again. The society is taking their constitutional rights more seriously, and the state is responding to that. Not always in the ways that we would like. I tweeted out last week that as they arrested 400 or 500 people, that didn't seem like a good way to respond to peaceful protest. And the MFA, represented here, I see, they responded right away. Reminded me of the Wall Street demonstrators, by the way, Occupy Wall Street demonstrators. I think that's healthy. I think that's good. That we're having that kind of conversation, A, between the state and society, and B, between our governments. I don't see anything wrong about that. What I do think is wrong is when it's not a conversation based on facts, right? So when we heard, and I heard time and time again, that McFaul is paying for the political opposition in Russia, that is not true. That is not true. Everybody, that is not true. You have to say it 5 times because people don't want, others have a political reason not to allow that truth to get through. We support civil society. We support the electoral observers. We're proud of that work. That they did good work. But we're not getting involved in those kinds of things. With respect to the attacks on Secretary Clinton and me, all I would say is our strategy for dealing with that is to engage as directly and as smartly and comprehensively as possible. Now, it's difficult in the environment that we work in, and that's why things like Twitter and Facebook are tremendously interesting tools for me. I only got on Twitter 6 weeks ago. I never had a Twitter account, not allowed to when I worked at the White House. And I was given very explicit instructions to use whatever means available to do what we call public diplomacy, right? So I use the media. I've been on Russian television, on state channels, Russia Today, as well as opposition. I think engagement is the right policy because we don't feel like we have anything to hide in terms of what we're trying to do. And I found Twitter to be a really interesting way to engage with Russian society. If you're not on Twitter, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I don't want to embarrass people that are closer to my age than Josh's, but I got to tell you, I felt like I knew something about Russia before I moved to Russia. I worked on it for a bit and written some books and been working at the White House for 3 years. The amount that I have learned in the last 8 weeks by just being on Twitter is just shocking to me. I never, ever expected it. So I encourage you, if you want to know what's going on in Russia, you have to be engaging with that part of society, not just the other parts. And by the way, it's very useful the work that you guys do. I frequently am using work that you guys do to push that into the Russian debate. It'd be great if you had a Russian edition, by the way. So work on that. But that's important too because you've got to push that kind of information to open up the debate. That's all. When I retweet other journalists, I'm doing it to open up the debate, not necessarily taking a position. And so that's how we deal with those kind of attacks.
Were the elections free and fair?
We put out a statement, which I'm sure you saw, and that reflects exactly what we thought, including the endorsement of the OSCE report, which we thought was very professionally done.
Okay, young lady in the back.
Yeah, hi, Claudia Rosette. You know Russia very well, I know from years ago. Hi, Anders. I have a question that I do not expect you can answer honestly or in full, but to Mengel Dostoevsky, even the diplomatic fibs might be interesting. And this is about Russia's relationship with Iran and the sanctions regime that has been expanding and tightening, and on which the U.S. administration appears to be relying to deal with the Iranian threat. In the last big sanctions push that the international community put together on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Russia was the leading violator, even while it sat on the Security Council. Senate's investigative subcommittee found corruption reaching up all the way to the Kremlin. There was never a single investigation in Russia. There were prosecutions in France, in the U.S., and a great many, never in Russia. And here we are again. We've just seen, and I take it as perhaps an emblematic sign, the ship, the Chariot, that delivered weapons to Syria in January and made the news, has just called in Iran, I'm told carrying Ukrainian generators. My question is, in this context, if there is any prayer of Russia not repeating with its remarkable talent and skill the sanctions evasions, then violations that have gone on before, who exactly in Russia is minding that store? Where does the buck stop? Is there any authority at all that you see trying to track this down, willing to prosecute violators, doing anything?
Well, I don't know the story of Iraq. I mean, I've read about it. I don't know any details about that, so I can't comment on that. What I would say is that Russia's relationship to 1929 is very different. That UN Security Council Resolution 1929 is very different. Well, I don't know if it's very different because I don't know the Iraq case. Let me just say this.
Today is fine. It was just to say they have experience in this.
Well, yeah. We do not see that happening right now. President Medvedev took very seriously the negotiations over that resolution. They deliberately carved out some things that they did not want to have come under those sanctions. And we don't, I mean, you should investigate it. And if you do, send me a copy. And I'll tweet it out. But no, seriously, I mean, I'm interested in that. We do not see that as a serious problem right now. And moreover, even more striking, the sanctions that we did and that then we are adhered to by law with the National Defense Authorization Act that Russia did not sign up for and did not support, and is emphatically argued with us, went beyond 1929 and was not done in good faith. Those companies that are affected by those sanctions, they're adhering to those sanctions. And the reason is not because they love America or love Iran or hate Iran. The reason is called the American dollar and the American system. And those that are affected by those don't want to be subject to losing, access to that system. So they're doing it not out of a policy, but out of self-interest. And I would say this is not yet a problem. Doesn't mean it might not develop to be one in the future. I don't know, but I don't see this as a problem right now.
Okay, next.
Yes, Ambassador Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Given the what I would call your kind of in-your-face introduction to Moscow as ambassador to the United States, do you think that where some circles consider you something of an enemy of the state, virtually, do you think that this has significantly damaged your ability to create the bonds of trust that is always necessary for a chief diplomat in another country with the powers that be, given the fact that President Putin, whether you like it or not, has been elected by a large majority in what were generally, I think, fair elections, and you're going to have to deal with him? Do you think that you're damaged now as a result of the initial stages of your ambassadorship?
No, I don't. And here's the reason. I worked for 3 years for the President of the United States on a policy called the Reset. And in that job, I worked with all those high-level officials every day, all the time, on some very, very hard issues. 1929, this resolution we keep coming back to, that was an effort, that was a 9-month set of negotiations of which the President of the United States was intimately involved. New START Treaty, another giant negotiation, very difficult negotiations that I was a part of. The last big one that we did, WTO, worked with Mr. Shuvalov and the entire Russian government to get that deal done, along with our counterparts. It wasn't just me, it was part of a team. And they all know that. They've dealt with me for 3 years, and in my personal meetings with people, I've had no problems whatsoever. It's one thing for campaign organizers to say, Orange Revolution, but at the very highest levels, and I mean the highest levels, I've had personal conversations to say, we're delighted you're here because we know we have somebody that is intimately involved with the execution and development of the policy. So for me personally, I've had, nobody's canceled any meetings, none of that whatsoever in terms of the Russian government. What happens on the internet and television, that's a different matter. Although, I got to say, I say engagement is our policy. So Mr. Pushkov did a program on me. He's a guy who has a television program. He's now the chairman of the International Relations Committee for the State Duma. If you saw it, it was pretty tough. There were a lot of inaccuracies, in my view. I had him over for dinner the next week. We're not going to agree, but we as an administration are not going to be the ones that allow this go back to some kind of cartoonization of Cold War tit for tat, black and white world. We're not going to do it. It's not our policy. If they want to do that, maybe they will, and we can't control what they do, but it's not what we're going to do. So I'm going to meet with Mr. Pushkov. I met with Mr. Leontiev the other day. He's another guy who said some pretty tough things about me. Mr. Rogozin and I trade tweets all the time. That's what I'm there to do. I'm there to engage and to execute our policy. The other thing, I'm not there to be anybody's friend. And I know that sounds kind of weird and shocking. I'm there to represent President Obama and the Obama administration and our national interests. And sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about that. In the discussion, your Russian has an accent, and you don't really understand our traditions. And I'm trying. I got lessons. I'm learning again, and I'm trying my best to learn all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm not there to be a student of Russian culture and history and friends with everybody. I'm there to advance our national interest and our policy. And I think given the background I have before and the backing I have from the President and Secretary Clinton, I think I'm a good representative, a highly qualified representative to continue to do that, even if it means at times there's going to be some heated exchanges, not just all lovely exchanges and lovely dinner parties and the diplomatic stuff that I'm also doing, by the way. I'm also having dinner parties and going to I'm doing that stuff too. Don't misread me.
Mr. Ambassador, we're conscious of your time. We've reached our witching hour. I think most of us in this room certainly concur with what you just said. We're all delighted you're there. We thank you for taking the time to share your experiences with us. We look forward to working with you and your colleagues on trying to get PNTR through quickly and successfully. We're going to have several meetings on it here at the Institute. We'll continue to push hard. We work with you a lot, and we thank you very much for all you're doing, and particularly for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.